In this video, I'm going to show you a technique for exporting both vector and raster layers from ArcMap, so you have full control over them when using Illustrator or Photoshop later in your design process. So to start with, I've got this very simple map in ArcMap that has some roads, some lakes, and then an elevation layer and a hillshade layer. And the elevation and hillshade layers are raster layers, and the elevation layer is semi-transparent so you can see the hillshade through it. And then the lakes and the roads are vector features. Now, if we were to just come up to File and Export Map and export this as an Illustrator file, what we would get is our layers for roads and lakes, and also this other layer that includes the frame that was our data frame in ArcMap. But then we also get this image layer that includes two groups, and within that image layer, you get all these little slices of image. You can see that each one of these images is actually just this ribbon of image, and these groups are sort of nonsensical. One is essentially for the first half of the page, and the other is for the second half of the page. So when Arc exports raster layers into an Illustrator document, it automatically does this sort of banding procedure with it, and it also just merges all of the layers together. So we're not getting any control over our hillshade layer separate from our elevation layer. So in order to correct for that, when we export from ArcMap, it's important to export our vector features separately from each of our raster features. So the first thing we're going to do is turn off both our elevation and our hillshade raster so that we're just seeing the vector features on our map. And then we can do an export as an Illustrator file for those vector features. So I'm going to call this vector, and I'm going to save it as an Illustrator file. And I'll save it with a fairly high resolution so that it's going to render all of the curves of our roads and the curves of the shoreline of our lakes at a fairly high resolution. I'll say save. And then the next step is going to be to turn off our vector features and turn on each of our raster features separately. So I'm going to start with the elevation raster, and right now this elevation raster is semi-transparent, and I don't want that because I can go and change the transparency of that layer once I'm in Illustrator or even once I'm in Photoshop. I'd rather that it just export all of the data so that I can then have full control over that dynamically later on in the process. So I'm going to go and right-click on elevation and go to Properties, and to the Display tab, and change that transparency, which is right now set at 75%, to 0, and hit OK. And it's important to export all of your vector features at 0% transparency as well. ArcMap will actually rasterize the vector features that are set to have any transparency greater than 0. It just can't code vector features in an Illustrator document with transparency levels, so it will automatically turn them into rasters and merge them with all the raster features that are in here in that same sort of banding pattern, which is really unfortunate and makes it impossible to edit those later. So I only have my elevation in here. It has no transparency, and now I'm going to go to File and Export Map and save just that one raster layer all by itself as either a JPEG or a TIFF. And it's fine to export that at 300 dpi. That's a print standard for raster images. So I'm going to call this elevation. And then in my last step, I'm going to turn off the elevation, turn on the hillshade. I'm just going to make sure that there's no transparency on that hillshade. Nope, it's 0% transparent. That's great. Okay. And then I'll export the hillshade also as a separate JPEG. So now over in Illustrator, I'll start by opening up the Illustrator file that I made with my vector features. So there's vector.ai, and you can see I've got my roads and my lakes in this file. And now I'm going to go ahead and make a separate layer, which I'll drag down and put at the very bottom, and then come up to File and say Place in order to bring in my elevation and my hillshade. And when you place a raster image in Illustrator, it's going to ask you whether you want to link that image. And if you keep link checked, what that means is it won't actually store the image in the Illustrator document. It will just link to where that image sits elsewhere on your computer or on the network, which means that your Illustrator document will have a smaller file size, but it also means that if you move that image that's sitting elsewhere on your computer or the network, it won't be able to find it. And so I think it's actually a good idea when you're making relatively small maps like this to uncheck link, so it will store that image directly in the Illustrator document. I'll hit place. So there's our elevation, and then also in that layer we're going to place our hillshade, and now we've got both of those images separately. So because we exported them separately and because we didn't have any transparency on them when we exported them, we can select them now and change their transparency, and we can go back throughout our map making process and edit that transparency as we want. We could also open these images in Photoshop and edit them as raster graphics, either changing their brightness and contrast or other aspects of the image. So exporting them separately gives us a lot of control over how they're displayed later on in the process. We can also now edit all of the vector features separately, so you can see the roads are in a group just like they always are when I export from ArcMap. I'm going to remove that clipping path and come up here, select the group and just ungroup them with Control-Shift-G. And then I can edit those paths by changing their color if I wanted to make them, for instance, white. I have full control over editing those vector features as well.